That morning, the little porch camera on Henry and Margaret Adams' cabin caught something they never expected to see in their lifetime. A starving bobcat climbing onto the wooden steps, resting both front paws on Henry's old boot, and crying. Its wet amber eyes stared straight at them. Then it turned toward the dark Ouachita woods and let out a long, broken call, as if begging, "Please, follow me." They were almost 70, supposed to be sipping their coffee in peace. But if they'd shut that door that day, more than 20 wild lives out there might never have found their way home to the forest. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The morning the bobcat came crying to their front steps, the sky over the Ouachita foothills was the color of an old bruise, all gray-blue and heavy. A thin mist clung to the pines and oaks behind the house, softening their edges, and the boards of the porch were still damp from the night's drizzle. Inside, the little cabin was warm and dim, the only sound the low murmur of the coffee maker and the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Henry Adams shuffled into the living room in his slippers, mug in hand, joints complaining the way they always did before the day warmed up. He was reaching for the remote when a sharp, broken sound cut through the quiet. It was not quite a yowl, not quite a cry, something in between that made the tiny hairs on his arms stand up. The sound came again, higher this time, like someone dragging a rusty hinge across metal. "What on earth is that?" he muttered. In the kitchen, Margaret looked up from the newspaper, the steam from her coffee rising in front of her lined face. Years in the ER had trained her ears to jump at odd noises, at the slightest change in breathing, in tone, in pain. She set her cup down, listening. The sound came a third time, muffled by the walls but unmistakably close. It had a wet edge to it, like air trying to squeeze past a throat full of tears. "That's not any coyote I've heard," she said, already moving toward the front door. Henry hesitated by the side table, glancing at the little monitor for their front porch camera. The night vision image had flipped to color at dawn. The gray planks of the porch, the faded red welcome mat, the forest beyond. Now, right in the center of the screen, something moved, a patchwork of tawny fur and dark spots. He blinked, leaned closer. It was a bobcat, standing squarely on their welcome mat. The animal looked wrong from the start. Its coat was rough and patchy, ribs just visible beneath the fur. Its shoulders slumped, as if some invisible weight hung from its neck. Mist beaded on its whiskers, and its wide, gold eyes looked straight at the door, unblinking. When it opened its mouth, the sound that came out made Henry's chest tighten. It was a long, strangled cry that rose and then broke, the way a grown man's voice breaks when he's trying not to sob. "Peg," Henry called, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Don't open that door. Yet." But she was already there, fingers resting lightly on the deadbolt, eyes squinting through the glass pane. "Oh, my Lord," she whispered. The bobcat was closer than she had expected, only a couple of feet away, its paws planted on the damp wood. It should have bolted at the sight of her. Every other bobcat they had ever glimpsed was just a streak of movement at the tree line, gone before you could say its name. This one stayed. It took a slow, careful step forward and placed both front paws on the toe of Henry's old work boot, left by the door. The claws were sheathed, pads spread, the weight of its body settling there like it was anchoring itself to their house. Its head tipped back, and for a long second its eyes met Margaret's through the glass. She had seen a lot in 50 years of nursing: pain, confusion, that blank, distant look when people checked out before their bodies did. Whatever stared back at her from that animal's eyes was not blank. It was raw. She saw exhaustion there, and something like pleading, a thin thread of hope fraying at the edges. The bobcat's sides rose and fell too fast. Each breath looked like work. Its left shoulder dipped slightly with every movement, like there was a weight or a wound it was trying to protect. Margaret could almost feel the rasp of its breath in her own chest, that tight, shallow pull you get when a lung is bruised or a rib is cracked. "Henry," she said quietly, without looking away, "it's not right. It's hurt." Before he could answer, the animal dropped back off the boot, turned its head toward the wall of trees, and let out another cry. This one was different, a long, hollow sound that carried down the gravel drive and bounced off the trunks in the mist. It echoed like a call in an empty church. Then it looked back at them, eyes bright, tail tip twitching. For just a moment, standing there in her worn flannel robe, Margaret had the strange, dizzy feeling that it might as well have spoken English. Everything in its posture said, "Come on, please. There's no one else." Behind her, Henry swallowed, the taste of coffee suddenly sour on his tongue. The sound that Cat was making tugged at something deep under his sternum, somewhere near the scar he carried from his bypass surgery. For a heartbeat, he was back on that hospital bed, listening to his own breath rattle in his ears, wondering if this was it. On the porch, the bobcat let out a shorter, choked sound, almost like a sob, and took one more step toward the edge of the steps, glancing between the trees and their door. The color had drained from Henry's face. He watched his wife's hand lift, her fingers brushing the lock. "Don't," he started, voice cracking. But she could feel that sound in her bones, in the memory of every late-night call she had answered, every pair of eyes that had begged her for one more chance. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing with it the sharp metallic tang of wet earth and something else, fainter, darker, like old blood drying on stone. Margaret drew in a slow breath. Somewhere deep in the woods, a crow called once and fell silent. The bobcat waited, trembling, its gaze never leaving the door. "Henry," she said, barely louder than a breath, "I don't think this is about us being safe. I think something out there is dying." She turned the deadbolt with a soft, final click. The door eased open on a breath of cold, wet air. The smell of damp wood, pine sap, and something metallic slipped into the warm little house. Henry's hand landed on the edge of the door, stopping it before it swung wide. "Margaret, have you lost your mind?" he whispered, face pale as paper. "It's a bobcat, for heaven's sake." The animal was closer now, the grain of the porch boards visible beneath its paws. Up close, Margaret could see every ragged edge of fur, the sticky clumps along its flank, the way its whiskers trembled with each breath. Its eyes flicked from her to Henry, pupils wide, catching the thin morning light like chips of amber glass. "I know what it is," she said softly. Years in fluorescent-lit ER rooms came back in a rush, the flat alarms, the beeping, the smell of disinfectant and sweat. "And I know what that breathing sounds like. Look at its side, Henry. It's struggling." He could feel his own chest tighten, the phantom pressure of the surgeon's hands pressing down on his sternum, the memory of waking up with tubes in his throat. He dragged his gaze away from the cat and jabbed a thumb toward the phone on the hall table. "That's what we have game and fish for. We're almost 70. Our job is to call the people with guns and tranquilizers, not go traipsing off into the woods behind some half-dead wild animal." Outside, the bobcat let out another sound, shorter this time, almost like a cough that never fully cleared. Its ears flattened for a heartbeat, then lifted again. It turned its head toward the tree line, gave a long, hollow cry that echoed down the gravel drive, then looked back at them with a raw, impatient energy. Margaret felt it like a tug behind her ribs. She thought of a young man years ago, carried into her ER on a stretcher after a wreck on the highway. His eyes had found hers over the oxygen mask, wet, terrified, pleading. She had done everything she could, and still he had slipped away while she was in the next room, washing her hands. For weeks afterward, she had heard his mother's low, broken sounds in her sleep. "If we shut this door," she said quietly, "we're going to hear that sound in our heads every night. It didn't come to the wrong house by accident." Henry ran a shaking hand over his face. The kitchen clock ticked behind them, steady and indifferent. The Bobcat shifted its weight, that slight hitch in its left shoulder more obvious now, as if an invisible knife twisted somewhere under the skin. He stepped back, grabbed his phone with stiff fingers, and opened the location sharing app. His thumb hovered a second, then he tapped Mike's name, the old army buddy who now spent his days tinkering in a garage in the town and complaining about politics over coffee. He typed slowly, every letter feeling heavier than it should. "Following injured Bobcat into woods. Our place. If we're not back by dark, call sheriff." A moment later, a tiny gray check mark appeared. Message sent. "Fine," he muttered. "We take the radios, the first aid kit, and we don't go far. First sign of trouble, we turn around. Deal?" Margaret nodded, though in her gut she knew this was not going to be a short walk. She grabbed the battered orange first aid box from under the hall table, shrugged into her rain jacket, felt the chill of the zipper against the thin skin of her neck. Henry clipped the old crackling walkie-talkies to their belts, the plastic cool and familiar in his palm. When they stepped fully onto the porch, the world outside felt sharper somehow. The gray light had a cold edge to it, the damp boards cool under their soles. The Bobcat backed away just enough to give them room, then turned toward the trees, tail low, shoulders hunched. It gave one last shivering cry, then started down the path that led away from the cabin into the waiting green gloom. Henry glanced back at the open doorway, at the soft yellow glow of their living room lamp spilling onto the floor. His chest ached with the urge to slam the door, lock it, and pretend this morning had never happened. Instead, he pulled the door until it was almost shut, leaving it just barely latched. "We're fools," he said under his breath. Beside him, Margaret watched the Bobcat pause at the edge of the woods, look back over its shoulder as if counting them. She felt a strange steadiness settle over her, quiet and solid, like the weight of a hand on her shoulder in the middle of chaos. "Maybe," she replied, "or maybe we're exactly who it was hoping would answer." Together, they stepped off the safety of the porch and followed the crying cat toward the dark line of trees. The Bobcat slipped into the trees like a shadow with bones, and they followed, the damp grass soaking through the toes of Henry's sneakers with a cold that felt far too sharp for a mild Arkansas morning. The world changed the instant the forest swallowed them. The soft hum of the highway far off, the faint rattle of their old porch swing in the breeze. All of it dropped away like someone had closed a door behind them. Under the canopy, the light turned a greenish gray, filtered through layers of pine needles and oak leaves still wet from the night. Water dripped from branch tips in slow, measured beats. The air smelled of wet bark, sour leaf rot, and that deep, dark earth smell that seemed to come from another century. Their breaths sounded too loud in their own ears. Henry realized after a minute or two what was wrong. "There's no birds," he murmured. He didn't mean to say it out loud, but the words slipped out anyway. No chickadees fussing, no woodpecker tapping, no jay screaming from high up like it always did when they walked the normal trail. The silence was thick enough to feel like cotton stuffed in his ears. Margaret nodded once. She felt it too, like walking into an ER room where every machine had gone flatline and everyone was holding their breath at the same time. Ahead of them, the Bobcat kept a slow, careful pace, close enough for them to see the twitch of its ears, far enough to dart away if it chose. Every dozen yards or so, it stopped, looked back to make sure they were still there, then moved on, tail low, shoulders rolling, with that odd hitch they'd seen on the porch. The ground underfoot changed from soft grass to a mess of fallen leaves and twigs that snapped under Henry's weight. He winced at each crack. Margaret kept her eyes moving, the way she used to scan monitors, left, right, ahead, back. Something glinted off to the side, a small bright line against the browns and greens. She stepped closer and frowned. A wire loop, old and rusty, half buried in the dirt. A snare. The metal felt cold and greasy when she nudged it with her boot. "Somebody's been setting traps back here," she said, throat tight. Henry's jaw clenched. A few yards farther, he spotted another one hanging from a sapling at knee height, its twisted loop waiting for a neck that would never see it. Then another, this time snapped and bent, as if something had fought like hell to get free. As they walked, the forest floor showed other scars, a low branch broken at an odd angle, a patch of disturbed leaves where something big had thrashed. The faint, sour stink of fear and musk lingered in the air, a scent he'd never noticed on their usual Sunday strolls. And then there were the tire tracks. They cut across a narrow clearing like deep, ugly scars, two ruts pressed hard into the earth, mud thrown up along the sides. These weren't the faint little grooves left by a neighbor's pickup. The tread was wide and heavy, the pattern the kind you saw on stock trailers and logging trucks. Henry crouched slowly, knees popping, and ran a fingertip along the track. The mud was still slightly tacky. "Not old," he said. "Day, maybe 2. Margaret didn't like the way the hair on the back of her neck prickled. She'd felt it before, that same crawling warning, walking into a room and knowing before anyone said a word that a patient was about to crash. They moved on, quieter now. Even the leaves under their shoes seemed to understand something was wrong, rustling in a lower, warier tone. The Bobcat led them down a gentle slope where the smell shifted, picking up a coppery note beneath the damp earth. She smelled it before she saw it, a sharp iron tang that sat on the back of her tongue. A few steps later, the ground in front of them darkened into a wide, irregular stain. The color had seeped into the dirt, dried now to a dull, rusty brown. Flies buzzed lazily over the edges. Margaret stopped, one hand going to her mouth. "Oh," she breathed. All around the stain were tracks, pressed deep into the soft soil. Not just the neat round prints of deer or the small, careful paws of raccoons. There were heavier marks, clawed, splayed, layered on top of one another, a crazy tangle of panic frozen in mud. Something big had gone down here. Maybe more than one something. Henry stared at the edge of the clearing, at a rough wooden stake driven into the ground a few feet away. A strip of faded pink flagging tape fluttered from it, the color hauntingly bright against all the browns and grays. On the side of the stake, half hidden by dirt and moss, someone had painted a small red symbol, a circle with 2 short lines through it. His throat went dry. He'd seen that mark before, years ago, in a different state, on a different patch of land that folks swore was just for deer and hogs. "That's not just some kid's hunting spot," he said quietly. "That's a culling mark." Margaret turned to him. "A what?" He swallowed, eyeing the dark stain, the broken brush at the edge of the trees, the heavy tire marks leading away. "It's what they used back in Texas," he said, voice thin. "At those private game preserves they didn't want the news to see, places where rich men came to pay for a sure kill." The Bobcat stood at the far side of the bloody patch, head low, eyes fixed on them. It gave a soft, broken cry that barely rose above a whisper, then turned and continued down a narrow, shadowed path. Henry felt his own face drain of color again. Whatever waited ahead, it wasn't going to be a simple story about an injured cat. The path narrowed as they moved on, more suggestion than trail now, just a faint depression where boots or hooves had worn the ground down over time. The bobcat threaded through the underbrush ahead of them, slipping between scrub oaks and young pines, its spotted back barely higher than the ferns. The air felt heavier here, thicker, like the forest was crowding in close to listen. They began to hear water before they saw it, a distant, steady rush, like someone running a bathtub in the next room with the door closed. The scent of damp stone and cold, clean creek water cut through the musk and leaf mold. The bobcat disappeared around a clump of mountain laurel, tail tip vanishing last. When they stepped past it, the ground just stopped. A narrow gorge opened at their feet, maybe 20 feet across, its sides made of raw, crumbling rock streaked with dark lines of moisture. At the bottom, a creek hurried through, foaming white where it bit at the stones. The sound rose up in a cool, hollow roar that filled Henry's ears, drowning out even the thump of his own heart. Spanning the gap was a bridge, if you could still call it that. Old timbers, gray and splintered, lay side by side across, two rusted steel beams. The boards sagged in the middle, some warped, some cracked clean through. One had already fallen, leaving a jagged hole that showed the water flickering far below like broken glass. The bobcat stood on the near end of the bridge, waiting. It glanced back at them, then stepped onto the first board with a lightness that made Henry's stomach flip. Its paws barely made a sound, claws gripping the wood as it moved. In a handful of steps, it was on the other side, turning to face them again, tail curling, giving a low, urgent sound. Henry swallowed. His mouth was dry as dust. A little wind funneled up from the gorge, smelling of wet rock and leaves and something sharp and mineral, and it cut straight through his jacket. His knees buzzed with a low, sour ache. "No," he said, almost to himself. "Absolutely not. We can call from here. We can go back," and Margaret stepped closer to the edge, peering down. The creek looked small from here, but she could hear the force in it, the way it slammed around the bend and hissed over hidden boulders. The boards creaked just from her shifting her weight nearby. Her pulse thudded in her ears, steady and fast, like the beep of a monitor turned up too loud. She pictured herself trying to sleep that night, that raw cry from the cat echoing in the dark, the memory of those bloodstains and traps and that strange red mark on the stake. "If we go back now," she said quietly, "we might as well have shut that door in its face." Henry stared at the bobcat on the far side. The animal stood still as stone, eyes fixed on them, the damp light catching the pale underside of its chin, the darker ruff along its cheeks. It didn't pace, didn't move on without them. It just waited. His chest gave a warning twinge, that familiar, mean pinch under the scar. He reached for the steel cable strung along one side of the bridge, felt the cold bite of rust under his fingers. The metal left a faint orange smear on his skin. "Hold the radio," he told her, voice shaky. "If I go down, you tell Mike I said I told you this was a dumb idea." "You're not going down," she answered, but her hand trembled a little as she took the walkie-talkie. He put his foot on the first plank. It groaned softly, wood fibers complaining after too many winters. Another step, then another. The creek noise rose up around him, cool and insistent, making the distance to the far side feel longer than it looked. Halfway out, one of the boards shifted under his shoe with a crack like a gunshot. Henry's leg plunged through empty air. The world lurched. The cable yanked hard against his palm as his weight dropped. For one frozen heartbeat, he saw nothing but the blur of gray wood and white water below. "Henry!" Margaret's voice knifed through the roar. She lunged forward, grabbing the back of his jacket with both hands. The fabric cut into her fingers, rough and cold. His shoulder wrenched. Pain flared down, his arm hot and electric. Together they hauled, his foot scraping splinters as he scrambled for purchase. He landed belly down on the boards, cheek pressed against the cold, damp wood. Somewhere below, the plank he'd broken tumbled end over end, hitting the water with a sharp, echoing crack before the current tore it away. For a long second, nobody moved. Henry could taste the iron tang of fear at the back of his throat, bitter and metallic. The creek hissed underneath, indifferent. Then he started laughing, a thin, breathless sound more like a cough. "Well," he wheezed, "that'll wake a man up." Margaret didn't laugh. She helped him to his knees, then to his feet, her hand steady and strong, though her own heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her neck. Together they shuffled the remaining distance, picking each step like it might be their last. When his shoes finally hit solid ground on the other side, Henry let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 20 years. Behind them, the bridge gave a tired creak, another board sagging a little farther toward the river. It felt, in a strange, quiet way, like the forest had just closed a door. The trees ahead grew taller, older, the light thinner and more sour-colored. The path broadened, bordered by bits of old, broken concrete and rusty scraps of metal half buried in moss, the bones of something man-made, long abandoned. The ground under their feet turned more to gravel than dirt, crunching in a different, sharper rhythm. The sound reached them first, a thin, ragged chorus of whines and low grunts, rising and falling at the edge of hearing. Not birds, not wind, pain. They came out onto the rim of a wide, circular pit, its walls carved from rock and rough step shelves. An old quarry, Henry realized, or some kind of excavation, left to fill with shadows and weeds. A chain-link fence leaned crookedly along part of the edge, more suggestion than barrier now. Down at the bottom, in a gray tangle of stones and muddy puddles, something moved. Margaret stepped to the edge and gripped the cold metal of the fence. Her breath caught. Spread across the floor of the pit were bodies, 2 hound dogs with raw patches on their flanks, a wild hog lying on its side, flanks heaving shallowly, foam crusted at the corners of its mouth. And there, near a slick of dark, almost black mud, was a small shape wrapped in spotted fur. A bobcat kitten, hardly bigger than a house cat, lay twisted on its side, one back leg caught in the steel jaw of a trap that gleamed dark against the rock. Every time it tried to move, the chain rattled, and a thin, broken cry scraped up the stone walls to where they stood, sour and sharp as vinegar in their ears. Above them, at the rim opposite, the adult bobcat stood, tail low, eyes blazing. It looked down at the kitten, then up at Henry and Margaret, and let out a sound so full of pain and fury it made the skin on their arms ripple. They both went pale as the truth settled over them like cold rain. This was not just an injured animal on their porch. They had stepped straight into someone else's killing ground. For a long beat, neither of them moved. The wind skimmed across the top of the pit, pulling the rank smell of old blood and fear up to where they stood. It clung to the back of Margaret's throat, thick and metallic, the way the ER used to smell after a bad wreck had come through. Then the little bobcat cried again. It was a thin, shredded sound, more air than voice, but it cut straight through her hesitation. She felt her body switch into a mode she knew by heart: assess, prioritize, act. Her eyes picked out details automatically. The way the kitten's sides fluttered too fast, the pale gums when it tried to pant, the ugly angle of the back leg where the steel jaws bit into fur and skin. "We can't leave it like that," she said, already scanning the rim for anything they could use. Henry followed her gaze, jaw clenched. An old length of climbing rope lay coiled near a rusted winch post, stiff with age but solid when he yanked on it. Somebody had used this pit for something more than dumping rocks. The thought made his stomach turn. He looped the rope around the base of a thick pine, tugged until the bark bit into the fibers. His fingers felt clumsy and cold, but the knots came back to him, muscle memory from younger days spent fixing lines on job sites. "I'll go down," he said. "The hell you will," she shot back. "Your heart doesn't need that kind of test. I've rappelled into worse holes than this with less warning." He met her eyes. For a second, they were both 30 years younger, arguing in a hospital parking lot about who was more tired. Then he nodded once, throat tight, and helped her cinch the rope around her waist and under her arms. The rough fibers scraped her palms, grounding her. The rock face was colder than she expected when she swung her feet over the edge. Dampness seeped through the knees of her jeans as she eased herself down, boot soles searching for cracks and ledges. Dust and tiny pebbles crumbled away, ticking against the stones below like weak raindrops. Above her, Henry's face was a pale oval against the gray sky, jaw working as he braced his old legs and fed the rope out slowly. Halfway down, the air cooled noticeably, taking on the sour stink of old urine and wet fur. Flies rose in lazy clouds when her boots finally hit the uneven floor, their buzzing a low, ugly hum in her ears. Up close, the animals were worse than they had looked from above, ribs showing, eyes dull, patches of skin raw where collars or chains had rubbed. The kitten was the smallest thing there. Up close, she could see faint spots ghosted across its fur, a bit of baby fluff still clinging around its ears. Its trapped leg was swollen and slick, the flesh pinched in gray ridges between the steel jaws. Every tiny movement made the metal creak and the chain clink against stone. "Hey there, sweetheart," she murmured, slipping into the calm tone she'd used 1,000 times at bedside. "Easy now, let's see what we've got." The kitten bared its teeth in a weak hiss, but its eyes were glassy, pupils blown wide with pain. Its chest fluttered under her fingertips, heart racing like a trapped bird. She opened the first aid box with hands that didn't quite match the age of the veins on the backs of them, pulling out gauze, a small bottle of antiseptic, the scissors. The trap was a heavy, brutal thing, jaws lined with teeth meant to hold, not kill fast. She tested the spring with her boot heel, gauging the resistance. Whoever set it hadn't bothered with padding. Cheap and efficient and cruel. "Henry," she called up, voice echoing off the rock. "You still got that camera?" "Yeah." His answer came down thin and distant. "Why?" "Because whoever did this isn't just poaching a deer or two. Take pictures. All of it. We're going to need proof." While he fumbled with the camera above, she went to work. One hand stayed on the kitten's shoulder, fingers pressing lightly, feeling each breath, each tiny tremor. With the other, she eased the scissors into the narrow gap between metal and skin, cutting away fur matted with blood so she could see what she was dealing with. The smell up close was sharp and hot, a mix of iron and fear and the sour tang of infection starting. "Easy," she whispered as the animal whimpered. "I know it hurts. Just a minute more." She found the release bar with the tip of her boot and took a deep breath. For a second, the whole ER came back, the surge of adrenaline when you pushed drugs and prayed, when you knew the next 30 seconds mattered more than anything. She put her weight on the bar and shoved. The trap screamed softly as the spring fought back, metal grinding on metal. Then, with a reluctant jolt, the jaws eased apart. The kitten jerked, claws raking the rock, a raw, broken cry tearing from its throat. Margaret slid her hand under the wounded leg as gently as she could, supporting the weight, keeping it from flopping. The limb felt wrong, too loose in one place, too hot in another. But there was still warmth, still a pulse thrumming against her fingertips. "That's it," she breathed, more to herself than to the animal. "You're not done yet." She wrapped the leg in clean gauze, layer over careful layer, not tight enough to choke off what blood still moved, just enough to stop the worst of the oozing and keep dirt out. Her knees ached from kneeling on cold stone, but she barely noticed. Above, the shutter of Henry's camera clicked again and again, each soft snap a small act of defiance. When she looked around the pit, really looked, the pattern became clear. Broken chain bolted to a rock, a plastic syringe half crushed under a boot print, an empty bottle of veterinary tranquilizer tucked behind a stone. Not chaos, not accident, system. "Henry, she called, voice rough. "You get those shots?" "Yeah," he answered. "Sending one to Mike now. Told him if we go quiet, he needs to raise hell." She slid an arm under the kitten's chest, feeling the thump of its heart against her wrist, and cradled it against her. It was all bone and tremble and heat. Above them, on the rim, the adult bobcat paced, tail lashing, eyes burning holes in the air. Just as she tightened her grip on the rope and shouted for Henry to haul her up, the mother froze, ears pricking. The fur along its spine rose in a stiff ridge. A low growl rolled out of its chest, deeper than anything they'd heard from it yet. A second later, faint at first, then growing, came the sound rolling through the trees from somewhere beyond the pit, the deep, throaty rumble of a big truck engine waking up. The bobcat's head snapped toward the sound. Then, with one last ragged look down at its injured young in Margaret's arms, it spun and bolted toward the trees. Whatever had torn this quiet forest into pieces was not finished yet. Henry hauled on the rope like his life depended on it. The coarse fibers burned his palms, but he didn't dare let up. Inch by inch, Margaret rose along the rock wall, the wounded kitten clutched tight against her chest. Dust and tiny stones rained down as her boots scraped for holds. When her hands finally reached the rim, he grabbed her under the arms and dragged her over, both of them collapsing onto the cold, gritty ground. For a moment they just lay there, lungs burning, the kitten's rapid heartbeat fluttering against Margaret's ribs. The truck noise grew louder, a deep, throbbing rumble that rolled through the trees and into their bones. It had that heavy diesel sound, the kind that meant size and weight and money. "We can't stay out in the open," Henry panted, "if whoever did this comes back and finds us standing over their pit." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Margaret pushed herself up, knees stiff, the kitten whimpering softly in her arms. The adult bobcat was already gone, a streak of spots and muscle swallowed by the undergrowth in the direction of the sound. "It's still leading us," she said, voice low. "It's not done." They skirted the pit, keeping low, branches brushing their shoulders, cold rainwater shaking loose in fat drops that slid down the backs of their necks. The rumble of the engine grew clearer, joined now by the faint clank of metal and a burst of music that cut off mid-beat when a door slammed. The smell hit next, sharp and sour and wrong. Not just animals. Bleach, manure, and something chemical underneath, like a vet's office left to go bad. As they pushed through a screen of scrub pines, the trees suddenly fell away, and a clearing opened up. At the far side sat a long metal building, dull gray walls streaked with rust. From the road, it would have looked like any old chicken house or equipment shed, the kind you pass 100 times and never notice. Up close, the details told a different story. Fresh tire tracks chewed the mud in front of the big sliding door. A hand-painted sign read, "Kincaid Exotic Ranch, Private." The black letters crooked but recent. On one side, a low fence ringed a bare patch of trampled dirt where nothing grew, as if too many frightened feet had pounded the life out of it. "Dale Kincaid," Henry muttered. "Saw him in the paper last year, some puff piece about bringing the wild to Ouachita County." Margaret's jaw tightened. Looks like he brought it all right. The bobcat appeared at the corner of the building, hugging the metal like a shadow. It glanced their way once, then slipped toward a smaller side door, hanging slightly crooked on its hinges. The engine noise cut off with a cough, and silence rushed in, thick and expectant. "Come on," Henry whispered. "If we're going to see, we see now." They crept along the tree line until they were close enough to smell the building itself. Warm metal, old urine, the flat, stomach-turning reek of too many animals in too little space. A narrow gap yawned where the side door didn't quite meet the frame. From inside came a thin, irregular chorus of sounds. A hoarse bark, a high whine, the dull thump of something throwing itself against wire. Margaret eased up to the gap and peered in. Her eyes took a moment to adjust from the gray light to the sickly glow of flickering fluorescent tubes. When they did, her breath caught sharp in her chest. Rows of cages stretched down both sides of a long concrete aisle. Some were welded wire, some were nothing more than old hog panels wired together. In one, a pair of lynx paced in tight, endless circles, fur dull, tails twitching. In another, a white fox lay curled in the back corner, sides barely moving. Raccoons hunched over metal bowls, eyes too bright, their paws raw from grabbing at wire. A hawk with ragged wings clung to a perch that was too small, claws digging into bare wood. And in several of the cages, spotted shapes. Bobcats, thin and silent, watched the door with flat, resigned eyes. The sound of metal scraping snapped her back. Somewhere toward the front of the barn, a larger door rolled open, showering dust from its track. Boots thudded on concrete, slow and heavy. A man's voice drifted back, casual and bored, words bouncing off tin walls. "Yeah, Friday night," he was saying into a phone. "2 cats, 3 foxes, maybe a lynx if she puts on enough weight. Tell them they want the young ones. They pay double." Margaret jerked away from the crack, heart slamming. Henry grabbed her elbow and pulled her behind a stack of old pallets leaning near the wall, the wood rough and damp against their backs. The kitten in her arms trembled, a faint, helpless shake she could feel all the way through her coat. The footsteps came closer, each heel strike echoing like a hammer. Through a gap between boards, Henry caught a glimpse of him as he walked by, a bulky man in a stained ball cap, keys jangling from his belt, a clipboard tucked under one arm. Middle-aged, soft around the middle, in that comfortable way of a man who hadn't had to sweat for his money in a while. Dale Kincaid. He moved down the row of cages, giving lazy kicks to doors, glancing at animals like they were boxes on a shelf. He laughed at something the person on the other end of the line said, the sound flat and humorless. "Don't worry about game and fish," he drawled. "They like their donation checks. Long as nobody pokes around where they shouldn't, everybody stays happy." Margaret's hands clenched around the kitten. Heat rose up the back of her neck, a hot, buzzing anger that made the edges of her vision go sharp. Henry saw the set of her jaw and shook his head just a fraction, eyes wide. "Not yet," his look said. "Not like this." Then, against her chest, something vibrated. It was small, barely there, but in the tight bubble of silence, it might as well have been a siren. Her phone, forgotten in her jacket pocket, buzzed with a new message. The sound was muffled, but Dale stopped mid-step. His head turned toward their side of the barn. He ended the call without a goodbye, shoving the phone into his pocket. For a terrifying second, he just stood there, listening. The fluorescent tubes hummed softly. Somewhere, a fox coughed. Henry pressed his palm over Margaret's pocket, trying to smother the vibration. He could feel her breathing under his hand, shallow and fast, the kitten's tiny chest fluttering between them. "Probably just the damn ballast," Dale muttered finally, giving one of the light fixtures a hard whack with his fist. The bulb flickered, buzzed louder, then steadied. He snorted, turned, and walked back toward the front, boots thumping, keys jingling. They stayed frozen until the sound of the outer door rolling shut and the engine roaring back to life shook the metal walls. Only then did Henry let out the breath he'd been holding, his whole body tingling with the aftertaste of fear. Margaret eased the kitten higher against her shoulder, its fur damp against her cheek. Through the crack in the door, she looked one more time at the rows of cages, the dull eyes pressed to wire, the little lives hanging on by a frayed thread. "This isn't just a bad neighbor," she whispered. "This is a business." Henry's face was ashen, but his eyes were hard. "And now we've seen it," he said, "all of it." They both understood in that cold, humming moment that there was no going back to their porch swing and quiet coffee as if this were some bad dream. Whatever happened next, that crying bobcat had dragged them right into the center of something much bigger and far more dangerous than either of them had imagined. They didn't talk until the barn was a smear of dull metal behind the trees. Only when they were back among the trunks, needles, brushing their shoulders and damp branches slapping at their sleeves, did Henry stop to breathe. "We've got enough," he said, voice low. "Pictures, names, that pit. We don't need to see any more to know what this is." The kitten stirred weakly against Margaret's chest, letting out a tiny, rasping mew. Its breath was hot through her jacket, too fast, too shallow. She could feel its heart fluttering against her sternum like a trapped moth. "We also don't have time," she replied. "That man's loading animals onto trucks. Every hour we wait, something back there dies on a concrete floor." They angled away from the barn and the pit, both following the faint rise of the land. With each step, the air seemed to thin out, the chemical stink fading, replaced by wet leaf and pine again. After a while, the noise under their feet changed, the soft give of soil turning to the crunch of gravel. They had climbed back toward the ridge. Henry checked his phone with a thumb that didn't feel quite steady. One bar of signal blinked in and out like a tired firefly. "Come on," he muttered. "Just give me enough." He jabbed at the screen, thumb clumsy with cold. The sheriff's number rang twice, 3 times, then clicked over. "County Sheriff's Office," a bored male voice said. "Deputy Collins?" "This is Henry Adams, out off County Road 17, near Ouachita," Henry said, words tumbling over each other. "My wife and I followed an injured bobcat into the woods and found a pit full of trapped animals and a barn full of everything. Lynx, foxes, bobcats. There are syringes, traps, syringes with veterinary drugs, and Dale Kincaid's name all over the paperwork. He's shipping them out for canned hunts or God knows what." There was a pause just long enough to prickle. "Sir," Collins said slowly, "Mr. Kincaid holds a valid exotic animal license with the state. You sure you're not just seeing his stock pens? He runs a legal operation out there. It's not really. Do legal operations leave kittens in steel traps at the bottom of a rock pit?" Margaret snapped, the exhaustion cracking her voice. "Do they starve hawks till their feathers fall out? I've worked ER for decades. I know neglect when I see it." Another pause, heavier this time. Somewhere on Collins's end, a chair squeaked. A phone rang. "Well, ma'am, I can make a note," he said finally. "Maybe send someone by in a day or two, but we can't just go stomping onto a permitted facility because—" In town, at that same moment, Mike Jenkins stood at the sheriff's front desk, the printed photo Henry had texted him trembling slightly in his weathered hand. He slapped it down in front of Collins, jabbing a calloused finger at the image of the pit, the trap, the bleeding kitten. "You gonna tell me this is stock pens, son?" Mike's voice had the low, dangerous calm of a man who'd spent time in places where people didn't. "Come back." Collins stared at the grainy print, Adam's apple, bobbing. At a nearby desk, a woman in a green Arkansas game and fish shirt looked up. Officer Lena Ruiz pushed her chair back and stood, dark brows drawing together. She walked over, boots quiet on the scuffed tile, and picked up the photo. "Where'd this come from?" she asked. "Henry and Margaret Adams," Mike said. "I've hunted with Henry 30 years. He doesn't spook easy, and he sure as hell doesn't make up traps and syringes." Ruiz's jaw tightened. She glanced at Collins, then at the blinking line on the switchboard labeled Adams H. "Patch him through to me," she said. "Now." A click, a crackle, and then Henry heard a new voice in his ear, steady, brisk, with a hint of concern under the professionalism. "Mr. Adams, this is Officer Lena Ruiz with Game and Fish," she said. "I've got a photo here that's making me real uncomfortable. I need your exact location, and I need you to tell me, do you feel like you're in immediate danger?" Henry glanced around at the gray trees, the sagging rope burns on his palms, the trembling bundle in Margaret's arms. "Not yet," he answered honestly. "But if Kincaid finds out we've seen what he's hiding, that could change real fast." "Understood. I want you and your wife to move back toward open ground, somewhere you can be found easily. Stay out of sight of that barn. Do not approach him again. We're sending units from here and from the state. You'll probably hear sirens before you see us." The line dropped once, then came back, the bar blinking stronger now, as if the air itself had decided to cooperate. By the time the sun had slipped behind the treetops and turned the sky a deep, bruised purple, the quiet woods around the Adams place no longer felt quiet. The distant wail of sirens floated through the trees, thin at first, then louder, overlapping. Headlights flared along the county road, beams cutting through mist. A helicopter's rotor thumped overhead, the rhythm deep and insistent, stirring the tops of the pines. Henry and Margaret stood at the edge of their driveway. The kitten swaddled in an old towel now, its eyes slitted but still alive. Blue and red lights splashed across their faces, painting the wrinkles in new colors. Sheriff's trucks, game and fish rigs, a heavy green truck with U.S. Fish and Wildlife stenciled on the side. One by one they turned into the gravel lane, engines growling. Ruiz climbed out of the lead truck, hat under her arm, eyes scanning the tree line. When she saw them, something in her posture softened for half a heartbeat. Then she was all business again. "You two have had quite a morning," she said. "You haven't seen anything yet," Henry replied. Under the rising whir of the helicopter and the distant bark of radios, they walked the officers through everything, step by step. The crying cat on the porch, the traps, the bloody clearing, the rotten bridge, the pit, the barn. Henry handed over his camera. Ruiz scrolled through the pictures, her mouth a hard line. "All right," she said finally, looking up at her team. "We've got probable cause, and then some. We go in careful, we go in fast, and we don't let a single crate roll off that property tonight." Hours later, from a safe distance on a low ridge, Henry and Margaret watched the clearing light up like some strange, harsh holiday. Spots from the helicopter painted the barn roof white. Flashlights bobbed along the ground. Voices shouted, muffled by distance and trees. When they finally saw Dale Kincaid being led out in handcuffs, his face pale in the harsh glare, he twisted his head and spotted them standing with Ruiz. "Old folks ought to stay on their porches," he called, voice ugly and bitter. World was quieter that way. Margaret felt the words like a slap. Before she could answer, Ruiz stepped forward, badge catching the light. "Lucky for these animals," she said coolly, "they didn't." The sirens, the shouting, the crackle of radios, all of it seemed to fade for a second as those words settled in. Somewhere out in the dark, a lone bobcat called once, a low, echoing sound, as if the forest itself were answering back. News travels fast in a small county, and faster still when there are flashing lights and a helicopter circling over the pines. Within days, a fuzzy photo of Dale Kincaid in handcuffs hit the local paper. Then the little rock stations, then a national site or two that liked stories with words like wildlife trafficking and secret killing fields. Reporters called the Adams house until the phone rang like a stubborn alarm clock. Henry and Margaret gave one interview at their kitchen table, the morning sun slanting across the checked vinyl and their chipped coffee mugs. They talked about the crying cat on the porch, about the bridge, the pit, the barn. The reporter's pen scratched quickly on her pad. Her eyes grew tight when she looked at the picture of the kitten in the trap. After that, the story took on a life of its own. State officers raided 2 more exotic ranches in neighboring counties. Photos of rusted traps and starving animals ran under headlines in bold black ink. At night, sitting in their creaky recliners with the TV flickering blue across the walls, Henry and Margaret saw strangers saying words like systemic problem and loopholes in our laws, all because they had opened a door one gray morning. In early spring, the Capitol in Little Rock called. The letter was stiff and formal, printed on heavy paper with a gold seal at the top. The Committee on Wildlife and Rural Affairs invited Mr. and Mrs. Adams to provide testimony regarding their personal experience with illegal captive facilities. Margaret smoothed the page out flat on the table, fingers lingering over the official crest. "I never thought I'd be going to the Capitol at my age," she said, half laughing, half dazed. "You and me both," Henry replied. "Last time I wore a tie, it was to a funeral." On the day of the hearing, the Capitol's marble floors felt cold through the soles of Henry's best shoes. The high ceilings made every cough echo. They sat at a long table under bright lights, microphones in front of them, rows of serious faces above nameplates, staring down. Margaret's hands shook a little as she adjusted the microphone, but when she began to speak, her voice steadied. She told them about the sound she'd heard on the porch, that wet, broken cry that didn't sound like any animal she'd ever known. She described the pit, the smell of old blood and fear, the weight of the kitten in her arms, the way its heart had fluttered against her palm. Henry talked about the rotten bridge, about the traps, about Kincaid's words in the barn. When they finished, the room was quiet for a long beat, the air heavy with that particular silence older folks recognized from funerals and bad news in hospital rooms. One representative cleared his throat, eyes shiny behind his glasses. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not staying on your porch." The laws would take months to change, maybe years, but something had shifted. They could feel it, like the sudden lift in air just before a thunderstorm breaks. 9 months after that first morning, Dr. Claire Monroe called from the Wildlife Center. Her voice crackled slightly over the line, but there was a smile in it. "We're releasing 4 of the bobcats next week," she said, "including one very stubborn female with a faint scar on her back leg. I thought you 2 might like to be there." The release site lay farther south, where the Ouachita forest grew deeper and wilder. The day they drove down, the sky was a clear, hard blue, the kind you only get after a cold front sweeps the haze away. The air smelled of sun-warmed needles and fresh dirt. A handful of staff and volunteers stood near the back of a pickup where 4 metal crates sat, doors facing a tangle of undergrowth. Claire met them with a firm handshake and a tired but genuine grin. "She gave us hell," she said, nodding toward one of the crates, "but that's why she's still here." When the first latch flipped, the bobcat inside exploded out like a coiled spring, a blur of muscle and spots disappearing into the green. The second and third followed, slipping into shadows with barely a sound. Then Claire knelt by the last crate and looked over at Margaret. "You want to do this one?" she asked. Margaret's fingers tingled as she reached for the latch. The metal was cool against her skin. She lifted it, swung the door open, and stepped back. The bobcat inside didn't bolt. She stepped out slowly, one paw at a time, the afternoon light striping her fur in bands of gold and brown. A faint pale line traced the curve of her back leg where the trap had once bitten down. For a few steps, she kept her head low, nose to the ground. Then she stopped, turned, and looked directly at them. Her eyes were the same deep yellow Margaret remembered from the porch, but clearer now, alive with wildness. For a moment, time folded in on itself. Margaret saw the crying animal on the wet boards, the tiny kitten in her arms, the cages, the barn, the flashing lights. All of it sat between them in the space of that gaze. The bobcat's ears flicked Wanma. She blinked slowly, almost like a nod, then melted into the brush with a soft rustle, swallowed whole by the forest that had nearly lost her. That night, back at the little cabin, the porch looked just the same as it had before any of this started. The same gray boards, the same scuffed welcome mat, the same tired swing creaking when the wind caught it. But to Henry and Margaret it felt different now, like a front-row seat to a world they'd once only watched from a distance. After a soft rain, Henry stepped out and noticed small, fresh prints in the thin film of mud by the bottom step. 4 neat pads, claws retracted, leading up toward the porch, then turning back into the trees. They were half-washed already, edges blurred, but they were there. He didn't call Margaret right away. He just stood there a while, breathing in the smell of wet earth and pine, listening to a lone owl call from somewhere up the hollow. The house light behind him threw a warm square onto the boards, reaching almost to the spot where a terrified bobcat had once placed its paws on his boot. In town, folks had started calling their place the house the bobcat came to cry at. The story got told and retold over meatloaf at the diner, over potluck casseroles at church, over coffee at the VFW hall. Details shifted a little each time, like all good stories do, but the heart of it stayed the same. One cold morning, something wild had asked for help, and 2 people old enough to know better had said yes. Later, sitting side by side on the swing, Margaret slipped her hand into Henry's. The air was cool, smelling of damp leaves and wood smoke from some neighbor's stove. Crickets sang in the ditch, a steady, scratchy chorus. "You ever wish we'd just shut the door that morning?" he asked quietly. She looked out toward the dark line of the trees, where shadows moved in ways they'd never quite be able to read. "Not for a second," she said. "Some cries you're meant to answer." He squeezed her hand. The porch creaked, the night breathed, and somewhere out in the black tangle of the Ouachitas, a bobcat slipped between trees, free. And for the first time in a long, long while, the world outside their front steps didn't feel quite so far away. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.